It began with a whisper that reached from the red earth of the Sahel to the polished corridors of Paris. A number appeared on the screens of intelligence analysts and journalists alike: 42%. That was the drop in attacks recorded inside Burkina Faso in less than a year. For many, it was impossible. For others, it was the first sign that something had changed in the heart of Africa. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a country once written off as fragile and landlocked had begun to rewrite its destiny. The reduction in violence was not only a military success, it was a signal, one that carried across borders and rattled long-standing assumptions about who controls stability in the Sahel. At dawn, in Ouagadougou, markets reopened in towns that had been silent for years. Children returned to school under the watch of local patrols. Farmers walked through lands once deserted by fear. These quiet moments did not make international headlines, but they marked the rebirth of confidence among ordinary Burkinabe. To the people, it was not about numbers. It was about breath, about life resuming its rhythm after years of uncertainty. In Europe, the reaction was different. News desks in Paris framed it as a mystery. How could a young officer, with limited resources and surrounded by regional chaos, achieve what multinational coalitions had failed to deliver for years? The question was unsettling because it challenged a familiar narrative that African security could only exist through external supervision. And yet, the reality on the ground told another story. Ibrahim Traoré had chosen to fight not only on the battlefield, but in the minds of his people. He replaced dependency with discipline and speeches with structure. The transformation of Burkina Faso was not a miracle. It was a method, a quiet revolution measured not in battles won, but in fear undone. When the announcement came, it was not through a grand speech or a military parade. It arrived quietly, almost hidden in a report by regional observers. Violent attacks in Burkina Faso had fallen by 42% within 1 year. The figure startled diplomats and analysts. For those who had watched the Sahel descend into chaos, such progress sounded almost implausible. Yet for the people living in the villages and towns of the north, it was real. They could see the difference in the way soldiers moved, in the way markets reopened, in the way fear began to retreat from daily life. The story did not begin with luck. It began with a decision. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had taken command in a moment of national exhaustion. The country was fragmented, surrounded by conflict, and drained by years of reliance on foreign missions that promised protection but left dependency in their wake. Instead of repeating that model, he made a choice that many saw as reckless. He restructured the army from the inside. Senior officers who had grown weary of endless coordination meetings were replaced by younger commanders who had fought on the front lines. They were trained not in distant academies, but in the dust of their own homeland. Within weeks, the military map of Burkina Faso began to change. Patrols returned to corridors long considered lost. Local defense groups were reorganized and trained under new oversight, turning scattered resistance into coordinated defense. Communication systems were decentralized. Civilian radio stations began to broadcast safety updates, connecting communities directly with local units. The strategy was simple, but revolutionary. The state would no longer depend on others to protect its people. It would protect itself. In a remote town near Kaya, a schoolteacher named Issa described the change in his own words. "For the first time in years, I can teach without counting the hours until sunset," he said. Behind his small classroom, the national flag waved again, not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder that someone still cared. In another village near Dori, women returned to the weekly market carrying baskets of millet. Soldiers no longer guarded the entrance. They walked among the crowd, unarmed, speaking with families. Trust, the rarest currency in times of war, was slowly returning. The effects reached beyond security. As routes reopened, the price of grain stabilized. Agricultural production in the northern provinces increased by 18%, a sign that peace and prosperity were intertwined. The return of transport routes allowed trade to flow again between small towns and the capital. For every 10 attacks prevented, 400 displaced families came back home. The rhythm of daily life became the new front line in a war for stability. But it was not only about soldiers or farmers. It was about control of information. Traore understood that victory in modern conflict depends on who shapes the narrative. He imposed a new rule inside government and military institutions: speak less, act more. Silence became strategy. Each report released to the public had to be factual, not rhetorical. Each image shared by the presidency showed work, not ceremony. The change in tone was subtle, but powerful. It replaced the language of victimhood with that of resilience. In Paris, the silence felt like defiance. Commentators began asking uncomfortable questions. How could a young African leader, barely in his 30s, succeed where multinational coalitions with billions in funding had failed? Was this stability real, or was it a mirage built on propaganda? The skepticism was predictable, yet on the ground, the results were undeniable. Roads once empty now carried school buses. Night markets stayed open past dusk. Even in border areas, where fear once ruled, life had resumed its fragile but steady pace. For Traore, the 42% reduction in attacks was not a number to celebrate, but a lesson to guard. Every percentage point was earned through coordination, sacrifice, and discipline. He called it the first phase of national recovery, not a victory. Our goal, he told his commanders, is not to survive. It is to rebuild. Those words spread across the country, echoed in homes, schools, and military posts alike. Yet behind the quiet success lay a question that no statistic could answer. Could this fragile progress endure the weight of expectation? Could a small nation, still battling poverty and external pressure, maintain stability without the safety net of foreign intervention? The world was watching, but in Burkina Faso, people had stopped waiting. They were too busy rebuilding. The real secret behind the 42% was not firepower or force. It was something deeper, something Paris could not measure. The belief that a nation could stand on its own feet again. In the months that followed the security turnaround, the mood inside Burkina Faso shifted from disbelief to determination. The 42% drop in attacks had proven that the country could defend itself, but it also ignited something deeper. The sense of pride that had been buried under years of dependence began to resurface. In cafes, radio shows, and classrooms, people spoke with a new vocabulary. The words were not of fear or fatigue, but of continuity, sovereignty, and responsibility. The streets of Ouagadougou reflected this change. Where military convoys once rolled with foreign flags, local patrols now passed in silence, disciplined and deliberate. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré visited the liberated northern town of Kaya, there were no parades or speeches. He simply walked through the marketplace, shaking hands with traders, listening to mothers who spoke of sending their children back to school. That single image broadcast on national television became symbolic. For many, it was the moment they realized that leadership could look like presence, not distance. But as calm settled within, tension began to rise without. In Paris, the headlines spoke of an unsettling mystery. How could a nation cut from foreign funding manage to reduce attacks so drastically? Commentators speculated about hidden alliances and unspoken strategies. French intelligence circles whispered about the role of Russian advisors and the tightening network of the Sahel alliance between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. To Western observers, Traoré's success seemed to defy the established order. Stability without supervision was an uncomfortable precedent. In Niger and Mali, however, the reaction was admiration. Government ministers praised Burkina Faso's discipline and efficiency, calling it proof that the Sahel can stand. The civic groups across the region began to borrow the language of sovereignty. In Bamako, students carried signs that read, "Our gold, our security, our future." In Niamey, soldiers painted the number 42 on their barracks walls, a tribute to the 42% that had become a symbol of African resilience. The idea spread faster than any official communiqué could have. Inside Burkina Faso, the success also redefined the relationship between the government and its people. Instead of grand political promises, ministries began publishing local progress reports. Villages received direct funding for reconstruction. Agricultural cooperatives gained priority in national budgets. For the first time in decades, rural citizens felt that the capital was not a distant place, but a partner. The new rhythm of governance was quiet, but deliberate. Each decision, no matter how small, was treated as a step toward permanence. Yet not everyone was convinced. In Paris, officials viewed the silence from Ouagadougou as defiance. "They are no longer asking permission," one French analyst remarked. In Washington, the tone was cautious, but intrigued. "If it works," one diplomat said off-record, "it changes everything." The idea that a small, landlocked nation could defy the patterns of aid dependency disturbed the political calculus of an entire region. Meanwhile, in the heart of Burkina Faso, ordinary people began to experience stability not as an abstract goal, but as a daily reality. In the northern provinces, where fear had once been constant, wedding celebrations returned. Farmers started cooperative projects, building irrigation systems with the help of local soldiers. The once bleak nights were lit by oil lamps again, small symbols of life reclaiming space from darkness. Traoré's government called this phase the return of rhythm. Every community meeting, every restored bridge, every reopened school was documented not for propaganda, but for accountability. His advisors insisted that sovereignty had to be measurable. The army was told to think like builders. Each secured zone had to become an economic zone within months. Soldiers carried tools alongside weapons, repairing wells and helping rebuild schools. It was a model of defense through development, but as Burkina Faso strengthened its hand, others began to feel its weight. Paris responded with diplomatic restraint, but visible unease. European aid programs were quietly reviewed. French media questioned whether the nation's new alliances would destabilize the region. Yet for many in Africa, the unease in Paris was proof of something larger, a shift in power. Across the Sahel, the message was clear. The days when sovereignty was granted are over. From now on, it would be built. But with every rise comes a test. Could Burkina Faso's new rhythm survive the storm that follows every silence? Or would external pressure return to remind the young captain that independence always comes with a price? By the time the headlines faded, the real work had begun. The fight for Burkina Faso's stability had moved from the battlefield to the boardroom, from military command to civilian life. What Captain Ibrahim Traoré had set in motion was more than a campaign against insurgency. It was a reconstruction of the state itself, built from the village outward. His approach was not to promise miracles, but to make recovery measurable. Inside the Ministry of Finance, reports began showing a pattern that few expected. As the number of attacks decreased, local revenues rose. Taxes collected from reopened markets increased by nearly 30%. The circulation of goods in the northern provinces, once crippled by road closures, doubled within 6 months. Economists in Ouagadougou called it the peace dividend, the idea that stability could become its own form of currency. In the town of Titao, once considered a no-go zone, families returned to farming. A woman named Mariam, who had fled 3 years earlier, now managed a small cooperative of sorghum growers. "We plant again because we trust again," she told a local journalist. Her words reflected a larger truth. Security was not only about guns and uniforms. It was about the return of confidence, the ability to plan for tomorrow without fear. The government seized this momentum to launch what it called the National Cohesion Program. Instead of focusing only on reconstruction, it aimed to link every local gain to an institutional reform. Repaired roads meant new trade routes. Reopened schools meant trained administrators. For every military success, there had to be a civic one. The army's victory would mean little if the state failed to follow. To achieve this, Traoré restructured the public administration. Ministries that once operated in isolation were required to coordinate through what his team called territorial cells. Each cell combined military officers, civil engineers, teachers, and local chiefs. Their mission was simple: translate security into service. If a town was declared safe, it needed water, teachers, and access to markets within weeks. Failure to deliver would mean failure to govern. This model changed the psychology of governance. Officials could no longer hide behind statistics or press releases. Every policy was tied to a place, every place to a story. Civil servants were now accountable not to foreign donors, but to their own citizens. In many ways, it was a return to the basics of nationhood, the rediscovery of what it meant to have an internal dialogue. The results were visible, even if fragile. By mid-2025, over 200 rural schools had reopened. Agricultural production in secured areas increased by almost 20%. Local banks, once shut down for fear of raids, reopened their branches. But perhaps the most significant shift was invisible. It was the change in tone among the people themselves. In towns once divided by fear, young men volunteered to join reconstruction brigades, helping repair bridges and irrigation systems. Women's groups organized literacy campaigns and community watch networks. The line between citizen and state began to blur, not through control, but through collaboration. Internationally, reactions were mixed. In African capitals, Burkina Faso's approach was hailed as pragmatic sovereignty. Leaders in Mali and Niger cited it as evidence that independence could be institutional, not ideological. In Paris and Brussels, the reaction was more cautious. Analysts warned that centralizing too much power under one leader could backfire. Yet even critics admitted that the Burkinabe system was delivering results that could not be ignored. Back home, Traoré maintained his disciplined silence. He rarely spoke in public, but his message echoed through the ministries. We build, we measure, we adjust. And his closest advisors described him not as a revolutionary, but as an engineer of governance, treating politics as a system of moving parts. Each policy had to work on the ground before it could be announced abroad. The question, however, lingered. Could this experiment in national discipline survive the inevitable tests ahead? Sanctions, food shortages, or regional tensions could still destabilize progress. But for now, the rhythm of reconstruction held steady. In every market, in every schoolyard, in every repaired road, the same quiet message resounded. The people of Burkina Faso were no longer waiting for stability. They were building it with their own hands. The next phase would reveal whether this balance between order and freedom could hold. Could the state remain firm without becoming rigid? Could sovereignty endure without silence turning into isolation? The answers would decide not only the fate of one nation, but the credibility of a new African model. When the world began to take notice of Burkina Faso's transformation, reactions were as divided as the map itself. In Africa, the narrative was one of pride and curiosity. In Europe, it was one of discomfort. But in the United States, the reaction was more analytical. American think tanks and policy institutes began to study what they called the Burkina equation, a model of security and sovereignty achieved without Western supervision. At first, Washington viewed Traoré's approach with skepticism. Reports from the State Department highlighted potential risks: concentration of power, limited transparency, and the growing influence of alternative allies such as Russia and Turkey. Yet behind closed doors, a different tone emerged. Intelligence assessments quietly admitted that the numbers were real. Attacks were down, trade was up, and local governance was stabilizing. A nation long dismissed as fragile had managed to rewrite its narrative through discipline rather than dependency. In Paris, the story provoked unease. The French press described Traoré's rise as a silent revolution that had diminished France's historic influence across the Sahel. French diplomats publicly called for cooperation, but privately worried that other Francophone nations might follow the same path. Within months, Mali and Niger intensified coordination with Burkina Faso under the alliance of Sahel states. To the Western eye, it looked like a geopolitical rupture. To Africans, it looked like renewal. Across the Atlantic, American strategists began to see opportunity. If the Sahel could stabilize itself, it could also become a partner in energy, technology, and counter-terrorism, not a burden. Policy papers proposed what they called collaborative independence, a framework for working with self-reliant nations without imposing conditions. It was a cautious acknowledgement that the world's balance of power was shifting, one disciplined nation at a time. For Traoré, none of this mattered as much as the view from home. His message remained focused on results: food security, functioning schools, and safe roads. He often said, "Stability is not a gift, it is work." That sentence captured what Washington analysts finally recognized: that Burkina Faso's success was not built on ideology but on endurance. As new powers compete for influence in the Sahel, one question remains: will the West learn to partner with a confident Africa, or will it repeat the mistakes of trying to control it? the story of Burkina Faso is still being written. What began as a campaign to reclaim security has evolved into a larger question about the future of an entire continent. Can Africa truly define progress on its own terms, or will old systems of dependency return under new names? For now, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's experiment stands as both a lesson and a warning. Sovereignty can be built, but it must be maintained every single day. The warning is clear. Every success attracts resistance. History has shown that when small nations begin to rise, external pressures follow. Sanctions, misinformation, and economic manipulation often replace direct intervention. The challenge for Burkina Faso will not be to win a single victory, but to survive the tests that come after it. Sustainability, transparency, and inclusion will decide whether the dream becomes a legacy or a cautionary tale. The same global forces that once dismissed the Sahel as unstable now study it with cautious respect. But admiration can quickly turn to interference if vigilance fades. At home, the momentum must hold. The people who rebuilt their markets, their schools, and their villages now carry the responsibility of protecting that progress. Sovereignty is not a flag or a speech. It is a discipline measured in the consistency of daily life. For Burkina Faso, every planted seed, every repaired road, and every reopened classroom is an act of resistance against the idea that Africa must always depend on others. Across the continent, a quiet revolution is spreading. From Bamako to Niamey, from Accra to Addis Ababa, young Africans are watching and learning that freedom is not given, but engineered. The Burkina model has shown that even limited resources can produce extraordinary results when guided by purpose and unity. The message is simple, but powerful. Independence is not about isolation. It is about authorship, the right to design one's own destiny. Now the call belongs to all who believe in that vision. Share the story, discuss it, question it, build upon it, because the real battle for Africa's future will not be fought in palaces or boardrooms, but in classrooms, workshops, and minds that refuse to wait for permission. The blueprint exists. The time to build is now.